serial killer left blood on Bumpy's umbrella. What Bumpy did with that umbrella made him BG blood-streaked Bumpy Johnson's umbrella, left there as a message. Harlem braced for violence. Instead, Bumpy kept walking, calm enough to make the man who spilled it realize fear had changed direction. The umbrella was closed when Bumpy Johnson stepped onto the sidewalk. The morning clean and ordinary until something dark caught his eye near the handle. He stopped, not sharply, just enough. A thin streak of blood had dried along the wood, deliberate, careless, meant to be seen. It wasn't fresh panic. It was a message. Someone wanted him to notice. Someone wanted a reaction loud enough for Harlem to hear. Bumpy did not look around. He did not wipe it away. He held the umbrella as he always did, weight balanced, shoulders easy, eyes forward. Men nearby felt it before they understood it. The pause was heavier than anger. In Harlem, blood in public asked a question. The usual answer was speed. Noise. An example made quickly. That was the expectation hanging in the air, tightening with every second he stood there. Bumpy walked. He moved down the block with the umbrella resting at his side, the mark still visible. Storefronts watched. Windows remembered. The insult followed him like a rumor with teeth. Whoever left it wanted fear to chase him, wanted witnesses, wanted the street to decide the ending. They believed violence would force his hand. But Bumpy had learned something earlier than most men. When a threat announces itself, it gives away its power. Silence keeps it. He reached the corner, paused for the light, and let the city see him calm. Not defiant, certain. The blood stayed where it was, unanswered, uncleaned. By the time he crossed, Harlem understood the shift. The message had landed, but it had not worked. And somewhere, the man who left it felt the first cold touch of doubt. Coming sooner now. Word of the umbrella spread before anyone dared ask questions. By mid-morning, whispers wove through the streets like a slow-moving current. Shopkeepers paused mid-sweep. Children froze in play. Men leaned from stoops to see. Blood on an umbrella was an insult. In Harlem, insults traveled faster than bullets. Bumpy Johnson walked past without glancing at the murmurs. He did not accelerate. He did not frown. His calm was a statement, loud enough for the neighborhood to understand. The man who wielded fear no longer dictated the rhythm here. The neighborhood absorbed it. Loyalty did not need to be shouted. It was in the silence between Bumpy's steps, the casual weight of the umbrella in his hand, the tilt of his fedora over steady eyes. Eyes that had seen far more than 5 men, far more than threats whispered in shadows. The corner boys who watched him pass felt it in their spines. Older men nodded to one another as he strolled by. Women with baskets of bread stopped talking mid-sentence. Everyone recognized the unspoken law. Respect was measured not in anger, but in restraint. Meanwhile, the man who left the blood waited, hoping for a reaction, hoping for chaos. He had assumed visibility would force it, that a public mark would ignite the streets. Instead, he discovered the first lesson of underestimating Bumpy Johnson. Control was invisible, but it was heavier than any weapon. Even the police felt it. Officers passing by slowed their patrols slightly, sensing that the streets themselves obeyed someone else. The tension was subtle, but palpable. A neighborhood in collective awareness, watching, waiting, knowing that the next move belonged to a man who did not panic. By afternoon, Harlem had seen the same image replay itself. Bumpy with umbrella in hand, moving calmly through streets that had braced for a storm. The insult remained unanswered. The neighborhood internalized it. This was not defiance. It was inevitability. Through silence, Bumpy had strengthened bonds and reminded every citizen of their place in the unspoken hierarchy. He did not need to raise a voice. He did not need to strike. Harlem had learned that some threats answer themselves. And somewhere, the man who hoped to provoke fury realized he had already lost the first round. He had waited in the shadows, confident in his plan. The umbrella, marked in blood, was meant to elicit terror, to provoke immediate action. 5 men were ready, guns gripped, muscles tense, poised to enforce the lesson. He believed fear was predictable. He believed it would lead Bumpy Johnson to stumble, to strike back, to make a scene worthy of respect or fear. Hours passed. He watched from a dimly lit room across the street, fingers drumming against the edge of the windowsill. The men he had sent fidgeted, glancing at each other, questioning the quiet. That quiet was the enemy they had not anticipated. Bumpy moved with purpose, but not haste. The umbrella hung at his side, a silent reminder of what had been done to him. Not a weapon, not a provocation. It was the mark, the message, and he carried it as though it were an extension of himself, unremarkable to anyone who had not been trained to read the signs. The streets themselves seemed to slow for him. Storefronts framed him like a stage. Fire escapes cast geometric shadows across the sidewalks, and even the children paused to watch him pass. Nothing in his movement suggested fear. Nothing suggested retaliation. Only authority, calm and unshakable. Inside, the man who had orchestrated this plan began to feel something he had not expected. The confidence that had guided him, that had allowed him to plan every detail, started to crack. Bumpy Johnson did not flinch. Bumpy Johnson did not rage. Bumpy Johnson did not even acknowledge the insult with a glance. Panic, subtle but real, began to replace his anticipation. Each minute that Bumpy walked past empty storefronts, that he continued without urgency, chipped away at the illusion of control the man had believed he owned. The expectation of fear had been the foundation of his strategy, and it was crumbling. The 5 men waiting outside the target buildings shifted, uncertain, questioning the silence, questioning their own training. Their hands tightened around revolvers that suddenly felt heavier than they had that morning. The calmness of a single man had unspooled the threads of their plan. By late afternoon, the orchestrator realized he was no longer in charge. The plan, the preparation, the assumed power, none of it mattered. One man, silent, deliberate, and calm, had rewritten the rules without raising a voice or firing a shot. And somewhere, across Harlem, Bumpy Johnson continued down the streets with the umbrella in hand, leaving doubt in the hearts of those who had sought to force fear upon him. The first cracks of submission had begun. Bumpy Johnson paused at the corner where the umbrella had first become a message. The morning's insult, soaked in blood and intended to provoke chaos, now felt impotent under his gaze. He did not raise his voice. He did not summon his enforcers. The neighborhood had already noticed. Control is measured in patience, not fists. The umbrella was no longer simply an object. It was the pivot, the tool through which Bumpy would turn fear back on its sender. He carried it lightly, almost carelessly, but every observer understood it bore weight, symbolic, moral, and unmistakable authority. Men on the street shifted subconsciously, making way for him, sensing that this was a man whose intentions could not be challenged by force. The man who had left the blood had assumed the streets themselves would erupt at the sight of it. He had imagined a spectacle, a scene of retaliation, the kind of noise and fury that confirmed his dominance. But as Bumpy moved, calm and deliberate, the tables shifted. Fear, he realized too late, had been handed over to the wrong side. Storefront windows reflected the umbrella, the subtle arc of its handle, and the unmistakable poise of the man carrying it. Shopkeepers whispered among themselves, noting Bumpy's restraint. Children lingered on stoops, watching a drama they did not yet fully understand. The message that had been intended to provoke now amplified his reputation. Silence had become leverage. He stopped at a narrow alley, far from the eyes of the casual passerby, and unfolded the umbrella, not to threaten, not to weaponize. He held it upright, the dried blood stark against polished wood, letting it speak in place of him. The streets felt the shift. Those who had intended to incite violence now recognized hesitation in their ranks, uncertainty in their hands. By afternoon, the neighborhood understood the lesson. In the absence of fury, respect strengthens. Bumpy moved carefully, every step measured, ensuring that the symbolic power of the umbrella remained clear. Men who had planned ambushes reconsidered their approach. Rivals weighed the consequences of acting rashly. Authority had not shouted. It had merely been present. The man behind the insult waited in a shadowed doorway, anxiously counting the minutes. Each second of inaction from Bumpy eroded his confidence. He had thought fear could be manufactured, that violence was the only language that commanded attention. He was discovering a truth older than him, older than the streets. Power respects patience, and impatience invites ruin. As night fell, the umbrella remained with Bumpy, no longer a message but a statement. He had not needed to strike. He had not raised a hand. He had only let the mark exist, visible, undeniable, and ultimately powerless in the presence of his calm. The neighborhood absorbed it. The man who intended fear absorbed it, and a hierarchy was reaffirmed without a drop of blood being spilled that day. By dusk, Harlem had learned what Bumpy intended from the beginning. Control was quiet, inevitable, and absolute. The streets whispered it. The men who had hoped to force chaos feared it. Bumpy Johnson had transformed an intended provocation into a demonstration of dominion. The umbrella, once a symbol of threat, was now a testament. Night had fallen over Harlem, but the streets were alive with tension. Shadows stretched long across brick walls, street lamps casting pools of light that barely reached the corners where whispers had gathered. The man who had left the blooded umbrella waited, anxiety gnawing at him, anticipating the moment when Bumpy Johnson would finally respond. Bumpy arrived without hurry, umbrella in hand, calm as always. His presence did not announce itself with noise or gesture. It simply existed. Every step he took was measured, deliberate, a quiet echo of authority that could be felt more than seen. The neighborhood had long since recognized this. Bumpy's power did not need display. It needed only acknowledgement. The man who had provoked him now faced the reality of miscalculation. The 5 hired guns who had accompanied him tensed, gripping revolvers that suddenly seemed cumbersome, almost ceremonial. Their strategy, built on fear and intimidation, collapsed under the weight of Bumpy's silence. Bumpy stopped a few paces from them. He did not raise his voice. He did not gesture. The umbrella, still marked with the dried blood, hung at his side, a simple reminder of the insult that had been delivered. His eyes, steady and unreadable, met the man's. In that silence, the message was absolute. Here, power was not demanded. It was owned. The man who had hoped to see chaos instead felt himself shrinking. He tried to form words, threats, excuses, but none would come. Each attempted motion, each panicked shift, only reinforced his submission. He understood, finally, that his intent had backfired. The blood had been meant to provoke, but in Bumpy's presence, it was meaningless. Bumpy took a single step forward, and the air shifted further. Nothing violent occurred, yet the fear that had been calculated as his tool now owned the man. One step had spoken louder than bullets. One silent stare had rewritten the balance of power. The hired guns relaxed only slightly, aware that their leader had lost command without resistance. They looked to Bumpy, silently acknowledging his dominance. The neighborhood had witnessed a lesson. Control does not require noise, and fear, once inverted, is the heaviest burden of all. When Bumpy finally turned and walked away, the man who had sent the threat remained rooted, shaken, and broken in a way no bullet could achieve. He had begged in silence, realizing the futility of his plot, and Harlem understood. Power wielded with restraint leaves marks deeper than violence ever could. By morning, the streets of Harlem had returned to their usual rhythm, but the story of the umbrella lingered. Bumpy Johnson's passage through the night was not measured in chaos or spectacle. It was measured in silence, in control, in a way a single man could bend fear without striking a hand. Shopkeepers swept sidewalks with a bit more care, not from threat, but from awareness. Children on stoops whispered to one another, retelling the events in hushed tones, imagining the calm that had turned terror inside out. Every gaze that met Bumpy's in passing carried an unspoken acknowledgement. Respect was not given lightly, but it was earned in moments like these. The man who had left the blood never spoke of it in public. His pride, once inflated by assumption and intent, had been stripped quietly, leaving him aware that power was not in the act of intimidation, but in the patience and composure that met it. He moved differently after that night, a shadow of his former arrogance, and he knew every time he looked at the streets that a single man had already marked the lines of authority. Bumpy returned to his routines, to the corners he frequented, to the cafes and clubs that were woven into the city's pulse. The umbrella, now cleaned but still remembered, sat in his hand as a quiet reminder of inevitability. Harlem did not need dramatics to understand what had happened. The lesson traveled silently, carried by whispers, nods, and knowing glances. Through restraint, he had turned fear into respect. Through patience, he had inverted power. And through quiet observation, he had left a legacy that would outlive the moment, teaching that authority is not proven by what is done in anger, but by what is allowed to unfold in control. Harlem never forgot, and neither did the man who had dared to leave blood on an umbrella. In the end, the story was not one of violence, but of dominance so complete it required no demonstration.